All right, the conversations have to continue. We've been doing them for a good chunk of the late spring and the early summer, and that went from Kamloops right to Saskatchewan. And yeah, we get distracted. A lot of balls being juggled in the air, but we've got to continue these, and we hope there'll be a big part of a potential federal election. I'm joined right now by Dr. Adele Perry from the University of Manitoba, and there's going to be a virtual Q&A on called Doing the Work, presented by the Center for Human Rights Research, and that's this Thursday. Dr. Perry, I really appreciate you coming on and spending some time with me in Toronto. Thank you for doing that.
Happy to be here.
Tell me a little bit about the conversation. And as I said, it's described as a virtual Q&A on what settlers need to know about the residential school system in Canada. That's a lot to unwrap, isn't it? I suppose where chronologically does a discussion like that begin?
Sure. So it's an event that's organized by the Center for Human Rights Research, which I'm the director of, and in collaboration with the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. And it's an event that kind of comes out of kind of a concern and kind of a conviction that non-Indigenous peoples, including myself, I'm a settler, need to take responsibility for the history and the ongoing impacts and relationships that are anchored kind of in the histories of residential schooling. And this has been something that has come up, in a range of ways, certainly following the completion of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2015. And it's something that has been, I think, there's been renewed attention to following kind of the confirmation of unmarked burials at Kamloops, at Cowess's, and at other places across the country. And I think one of the things that has sort of been made clear here is to what extent histories of residential schooling very much speak to profound truths about the history of colonialism in Canada, and that this is a history that has affected Indigenous people in kind of profound and lasting ways, but it's a history that non-Indigenous people are also bear significant responsibilities for. And one of the things that kind of comes out of that is this idea that part of what we need to do is do some of the work in learning about a history which many of us don't know much about. And I think in the past couple of weeks, we've seen in a number of settings, including in Manitoba, with comments made by the Premier and also by a cabinet minister, how damaging a lack of kind of appropriate knowledge about residential schooling can be. And one of the things that I think this panel is aiming to do is have non-Indigenous folks who have learned about residential schools and are continuing to learn about residential schools take on some of the work of educating our non-Indigenous colleagues, neighbors, friends, family members about what this history means.
That was I'm glad you referenced that, because that was a very, as I suppose the kids say it, but we say it too, that was a very viral moment with the new Minister of Indigenous Reconciliation and Northern Affairs. And obviously it was very, very discussed. And I thought, it feels like an important conversation to have. It wasn't just any kind of a gotcha moment. It's when you hear something that doesn't sound quite right, you should absolutely step up and make a statement. And that in that video, that certainly was made, to the point where the minister, who is Métis, issued a full apology the next day. And it seems like there's been more listening, there's been more education in the process of that comment, as opposed to confrontation or indifference to it.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think certainly, Wab Kinew, who's an MLA and the leader of the opposition and in Manitoba, and also a TRC honorary witness, stepped forward in the very specific moment. And I think people have continued to kind of step forward in a range of ways. But these are ongoing discussions, and these are ongoing projects and ongoing responsibilities that I think we all bear some kind of connection to. And I think what we're trying to kind of do with this event is sort of create a context where people's particular questions about histories of residential schooling and of colonization more generally can be addressed. Because I think what those comments from the Premier and the Minister make clear is some of sort of the problems with the ways many of us, and that includes me and others close to me, have been educated about these questions, and some of the ways that we can perhaps create other opportunities where Indigenous histories and Indigenous knowledge and the incredible kind of body of scholarship and research and advocacy and writing that has been undertaken by Indigenous people in the last decades can be kind of brought to the fore.
Dr. Adele Perry's kind enough to join us, Global News Radio, 640 Toronto. She's the director for the Center for Human Rights Research at the University of Manitoba. Both my parents taught. My dad taught history, did a lot of work with Indigenous students, and had a lot of Indigenous colleagues and things that he volunteered for. It's an odd thing, though, because I sat with them this summer outdoors, finally getting to visit after a long winter, and it was a weird reflection on their part that they both my mom and my father, both in education, said, we miss this on residential schools. We sure weren't taught it, and we weren't teaching it either. And I think for people maybe born more in the 40s as they were, and maybe even the 50s and the 60s, that's a familiar refrain, that this just was, it wasn't even, well, we're trying to brush this under the rug. It just wasn't known about as as frequently in the public school system, at least here in Ontario. Are you finding stories like that where you're like really, fair-minded, maybe liberal-leaning people, right-thinking people who want to do the right thing all the time? There was a lack of awareness about this, and it's hard to say it's ignorance, but if you don't know it and it was there, then for lack of a better term, a lot of people were ignorant to it.
Sure. And I think that's one of the points that the TRC's final report made in really powerful ways, which is the extent to which, education and the lack of it really played a critical role in both kind of creating and maintaining a system of residential schooling, and can play a critical role in kind of reconsidering that history and what it means for Canada as a whole. And I think one of the things that's kind of complicated about those situations is that, histories of colonization, and in this kind of context in particular of sort of settler colonialism, often mean that people who live relatively close to sort of different communities may know nothing at all about what a community that they may, on one hand, know something about, and on another hand, care something about, but they also live kind of in a social context where they are kind of protected in all sorts of small and large ways from being aware of what is going on in that community. And I think when, non-Indigenous people, like the communities that I come from, think about what we didn't know about histories of residential schooling, but also histories of separate healthcare for Indigenous people, the histories of quote unquote Indian hospitals that were a really important part of 20th and to some extent 21st century Canada. Those sorts of kind of really pressing kind of historical phenomena were often organized in ways that we went about our lives seemingly unaware. And that reflects the social power, that we had in that relationship, but it also kind of reflects some of the social relations that made those histories kind of continue to exist and to continue to kind of be sustained. So our ignorance was part of the story, in a sense, of residential schooling. But I think coming to terms with both the past and the present of colonialism means non-Indigenous people doing some of the work involved in learning about things that we have lived in a world that has strategically and self-servingly kind of protected us from.
Dr. Adele Perry joining us, Global News Radio, 640 Toronto. I wonder, with this being taught at younger age groups, I find it interesting. I know you're teaching, you're a university professor, but I'm sure you could relate to this. There will be that fine line, won't there, with educating our kids in elementary school systems about what happened, about residential schools, about the abuse, about what some would probably rightfully describe as a genocide of the Native people, certainly in certain geographical areas and contexts, and then also making them understand it without making them feel responsible. There would be that line, wouldn't there, with if you're teaching this to a grade 4 student or even younger. University, we kind of get it. We can reckon and reason with our past a little bit more. How would you weigh in on that? Is there that fine line in elementary school? You almost do have to massage heavy events in history? I know a lot of these debates are happening in the States right now. How would you view this one?
Yeah, well, I am not an expert on kind of education of younger learners, but I have many kind of colleagues who work in these fields who have developed curricula, both kind of formally and informally, teaching kind of tools, educational resources that are sort of designed to do just that. And I think often, one of the things that they focus on with younger learners is the basic sort of the basic history of children being separated from their families and their communities, which is, I think, often a kind of a framing that's children, very much get the impact of, and speaks to sort of some very kind of core aspects of those histories. But I think one of the things that we've really seen, around the TRC and some of the things flowing out of it is folks working in a range of ways to develop curricula and resources that are designed, to do just the sort of the things that you talked about, namely kind of speak in meaningful and appropriate ways about these histories and other difficult histories as well, to a range of different ages.
I know. I know it's also a scenario where the people have to be conscious of not just keeping it doesn't necessarily have to stay in the news cycle. Although, to be perfectly honest, that's where I think a lot of awareness came out, was massively important news stories, leading newscasts on national and local TV, of course, and in big newspapers. But there also has to be a way to sort of recognize and push back on I suppose any kind of denialism of this or reframing of the history, because probably the sanitization of these schools is what's kept this going for 30 plus years and made people so frustrated who know what really happened and again so unenlightened as maybe I would have been in high school or elementary school of this also.
One of our panelists will be joining us on Thursday is Sean Carlton, who's a colleague of mine at the University of Manitoba, but he's written a really interesting recent piece in the Conversation Canada with Daniel Heath Justice from UBC, where they identify what they call sort of a bunch of sort of the basic strategies of residential school denialism and kind of how it functions in kind of contemporary discussions. And I think sort of identifying that not just as sort of an occasional thing that comes up by a certain senator or a certain, opinion maker somewhere, but as kind of a way of sort of thinking and approaching these questions that can be both identified and challenged is really significant. I think one of the things that in the past couple of months has become clear is that some of the points that we thought, were pretty much kind of made clear by the TRC and the responses to it, had new people to reach, that there were people who, for this was a kind of news, or it certainly changed the conversation. And I think that reflects the kind of the need for ongoing research, the need for ongoing awareness, the need for ongoing education, and the need to sort of think seriously about how colonialism created Canada for all of us and continues to create Canada for all of us in ways that have disadvantaged Indigenous people in small and large ways, and in ways that have also shaped the history for those of us who are non-Indigenous in this country.
Adele Perry is our guest, Director, Center of Human Rights Research at University of Manitoba. Last thing for you, and it kind of picks up on what you'll talk about Thursday and some of the conversations we've talked about. Can we get a lot of this done in a good way to advance the conversation, to increase, to better the relationship between settlers and Indigenous communities, so that there's not, there's bound to be resentment, there's bound to be a lack of distrust until tangible things happen. Look where we're at with some First Nations communities and their drinking water based on some of the promises of the last 6 years. I guess I really hope we can move forward and get a lot of this work done quickly, yet in depth, because I don't want to pass this on to my kids. That's a conversation I hear from a lot of people in their 40s. They don't want their kids to be having this, weigh them down. These are important things and they happened, but let's do the work now so that there's nothing new that gets passed on to the next generation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I see your point, and I think, you know, I've lived for a little more than half a century now, and I think a lot of the issues that continue to kind of dominate headlines have done so cyclically since I've been
Mhm.
alive. You know, certainly since the middle of the '60s, and in lots of ways since the last part of the 19th century. These have been issues that non-Indigenous people have paid attention to every so often, and then have kind of fallen away from view. They certainly demand our attention, and they demand our action, and they demand our resources. But I think that will be ongoing. In a sense, these are the histories that produced Canada, and they are ones that I think we will change how we engage with them, and change, hopefully in a good way that speaks to some of those aspirations you spoke about. But I also think that, having these discussions, however kind of uncomfortable they might be, are necessary given the histories that have brought us all here.
Yeah. No, no. Yeah. There's no wherewithal to shove this under the carpet and you know, leave it for a year or two. But you're right. It seems like it's in our face. It's there. It's something we're talking about. Oka. We're talking about you know, Ipperwash here in Ontario, 1995, and then
Mhm.
we just pivot to something else, and then years
Right.
go by and decades go by. And you're right. The conversations aren't had. And we just move right along. You're not wrong about that.
Yeah, history can be a bit of a drag sometimes.
But it's putting it mildly. Dr. Adele Perry, thank you very much for the time here in Toronto. Really do appreciate you coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.